Oh, you're on. You're in big trouble, though, pal. I eat pieces of shit like you for breakfast.
You eat pieces of shit for breakfast?
No.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes, and today I have a special guest with me. He's an artist, an editor, a creative director, an American entrepreneur, and New York Times #1 bestseller. How you doing, Brett Smith?
Good. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
I recently did a video about how editorial and writing standards have kind of degraded over time in the comic book industry.
Mm-hmm.
You're an artist, so let's talk about some art standards. In your opinion, has the standard of art quality declined in the industry?
Yeah, I think so. I definitely think so. There's a guy on Twitter called the Spinner Rack that I follow, who I really like, and he's always posting pictures of covers from the 70s and the 80s, and you just look at some of the artwork from that era, and a lot of it is so much more dynamic and alive. The bar has definitely been lowered, and I think a lot of it has to do with a lot of those guys, your Sal Buscema's, John Buscema's, Cockrum and Frank Miller, a lot of those guys from that era. They were all classically trained. They all went to art school. They learned about they took life drawing and learned about composition, positive and negative space, all those things that you learn at art school. One of the guys that I like to work with, Sergio Cariello, he went to the Joe Kubert School of Art, and obviously, Joe's one of those masters, and you can see that in Adam and Andy's work, quite a bit. You see a lot of that dynamism that used to exist within comics. Everything today looks very stiff to me, and I think a lot of these guys are using Poser or some of these 3D programs where you can set up your characters and everything, and that's really not the way that I was taught. I was taught, when you do life drawing, you do gestural drawings and you do quick gestural drawings, and that's to kind of it just gives things more life, really. And you also, I have an animation degree, so you also learn to exaggerate, and that's one thing that kind of disappears when you're using 3D models. Everything's kind of stiff, and it's not sort of exaggerated. You look at Olivier Copiel, he's an ex-animator. His stuff has so much life and movement and flow. Some of his stuff almost looks like it's in motion and it's a static image, So and you see that with some artists, but these days, but it's definitely, I think, something that's kind of dying out.
One of the great things about comic books is the medium itself, is that you can pose your characters any way you want. They can be in any action scene. You're not limited by that budget, production budget maybe you get on live action and stuff. And people aren't taking advantage of the medium and using it to their fullest, because they're using 3D models, or maybe they become too dependent on maybe digital art programs rather than developing the skills beforehand.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's just something to be said about learning everything traditionally. And then that's something else which is kind of, I think, starting to go away. And a lot of it comes from convenience. When I started out in the business in 1995, we were still using, as colorists, we were all still using traditional mediums. So me and Jason Jensen at Chaos Comics were using Pantone markers, charcoal pencil, and white gouache, and airbrush. I think there's really nothing that compares to learning this stuff in a traditional manner, because it forces you to develop technique and to get another guy that I follow who's a good friend of mine is Mark Morales on Twitter, and I encourage everybody to follow Mark, because he'll post little videos of him inking Ed McGuinness or Olivier or some of the top Marvel artists. And Mark still does everything traditional. And you'll see the quill pens and the brushes. Sometimes he uses a pen, but most of it's all pen and ink. And it's just incredible to watch him work. And I just think that, I remember when we switched over to Photoshop, and there's a lot of great things about Photoshop. The convenience is wonderful. But there's something to be said for learning these traditional methods, even things like color theory, which doesn't seem like a whole lot of colorists have bothered to learn these days, because I see a lot of amateur work, a lot of amateur mistakes, things that I did when I was first starting out that you learn over the course of time are just, bad habits you want to break. Really important to learn this stuff traditionally, to develop a technique, and also to kind of learn in the form of sort of the old masters, and when I say old masters, Buscema, Ramita, Barry Windsor Smith, Art Adams, a lot of these guys who came before us, who studied all that stuff, and then implemented that into their cover work and into their panel work. I see a lot of issues with coloring these days, and the biggest one that I see is focal points. A lot of these guys do all this detail and all this intricate rendering where it's not needed. Where you want the eye to go, where you want the eye to focus is where you have to have all your detail. 90% of your detail, 100% of your detail is in this area of a focal point where you want the eye to go, to target, the direction. The rest of it can all fall off. And I don't see that. I see these guys doing all this work and all this extra work they don't need to do. And then you end up having an image where your eye doesn't know where to go, and it just looks like a big mess of detail.
Initially, you mentioned going to like a traditional art school environment to learn the basics.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I've kind of seen just going out of style, across a lot of different vocations is like an apprenticeship. Do you think that's also been lost, where you go in there and you do some backup work for a master? Maybe he gives you a project here or there, and then you learn like from a true great over time.
Yeah, definitely. I had a lot of people that helped me over the years. When I got the job at Chaos Comics, I was working as an apprentice under Jason Jensen, who was the lead colorist, and he colored all the stuff that Stephen Hughes did during that era. He was really doing 98% of all the coloring at Chaos. And Jason, I was originally supposed to be just, I was still in high school, so I was working kind of part-time at Chaos, and I would go in the afternoons and just kind of sit over Jason's shoulder and watch him work and watch his technique. And then I started doing some backgrounds for him and using his markers so everything was consistent. And then after probably about 3 or 4 weeks, Brian just said, I think you're ready. He said, originally I thought that you would stay as an apprentice a little bit longer, but he said, you're a quick study, which I always have been. And he just said, I think we're going to give you your own little story, your own 12-page story in Chaos Quarterly. And I hadn't even graduated high school yet. And I was kind of already sort of like a journeyman. But even though I was still doing my own story, and they had plans for me to do some other small things and work on cards, we had a lot of trading cards back then. They'd throw me a cover every once in a while. So Brian was kind of slowly sort of breaking me in and getting me prepared and ready to do interior work, more interior work, and more covers. But he still wanted me to be sort of still studying under Jason. But it was invaluable. There's no way that I would have been able to get to where I eventually ended up without Jason, and without Jason's help and his tutelage. And he's such a great guy. He's such an incredibly nice guy, a very sweet guy. And also Jason taught me a regimented work schedule. He taught me some very good habits, because I was pretty green. I didn't have any good or bad habits. I was just sort of this blank slate. So it was great to be able to learn from somebody who was not only successful and really good at their craft, but also to learn how to be a team player and a good colorist, good all around colorist and artist. So apprenticeships are huge. I think they're invaluable, really important.
So it sounds like, maybe some of the foundational skills are lacking. Maybe there's some crutches on some of the new technology. People aren't getting that mentorship or that apprenticeship that they need. We hear a lot about maybe the pay being has changed a lot over the years, and maybe that's one of the deterrents that keeps maybe some of the higher ceiling talent from even entering into the comic book industry and making that their vocation. Do you think that the pay is a detriment right now to the craft of illustrating comic books?
Absolutely. The pay hasn't really changed in 20 years, and it's not keeping current with inflation and living standards.
Mm-hmm.
Cost of living goes up an average in America 2% a year, and all these guys are working on page rates which are over 20 years old, and in the case of DC, it wasn't until I think 2013 or 2014 that they started giving colorists royalties, and of course the percentage that they gave the colorists came out of the percentage that they give the writer and the artist, which was a bad move.
Creates a little friction, like a little animosity.
I don't see how it could how it could go any other way. I thought that was really a lame move, because we had all been complaining. DC sends this email out to everybody every couple of years or every year, and it says, it's like a questionnaire. What would you like to see change in the industry? How do you think things could improve? Blah, blah, blah. And all of us colorists, Paul Mounts being one of the more vocal guys out there, was saying more, especially to DC, you guys have got to start paying colorists royalties. Royalties don't kick in on any book for any artist unless it reaches a certain threshold. And it used to be like 50,000 units. So I remember I was working on Harley Quinn, I think when the royalties kicked in, and I still see some of that money, but it's pittance. It's nothing. It's not any, it might pay for a grocery bill or a cable, an internet bill, or, something. It ain't going to pay your rent. It's just not that much. And then take into consideration that you don't own any of this stuff. You have no ownership of it. It's all Marvel and DC's IP. So, I think that the pay is driving a lot of really good talent that would be working for Marvel and DC into creator-owned projects, which are either crowdfunded or financed or with, other types of publishers.
I wanted to talk about that. Perfect segue. I know you did the color work on one of the bigger crowdfunded comic books ever. Jawbreaker's Lost Soul. We've seen John Malin exit. From Marvel, he's doing his own creator-owned work using crowdfunding. Ethan Van Sciver is another big name. Brian Pulido, who you mentioned, he has his own industry
monster
doing crowdfunding comics.
Yeah.
Do you see, and we've heard Sean Gordon Murphy, who's a huge name at DC Comics right now, is planning on doing his own crowdfunded comic. Do you think some of these premier talent, the upper echelon, who see their value probably is greater than the piece of pie that they're getting, with the big two, are just going to say, I don't need that. I can foster my own audience. My work speaks for itself, and I'll just go do crowdfunding books.
Yeah, I mean, Walt Simonson's another great example, who's not doing crowdfunding, but Ragnarok is Laura Martin, one of the greatest colorists of all time. And anytime I ever complain about the pay, she always likes my comment. I look at what an amazing creative team that Walt's got on that book, and he owns it. It's his baby. And I'm sure, I don't know if Laura has a piece of that or not. I'm sure she does. I can't imagine Walt not including her in on that. But, it's not just the pay, but, say somebody from Hollywood or Netflix or somebody wants to produce that into a live action or an animated series, it's going to be Walt that benefits. And why shouldn't it? I hate the phrase starving artist. I think that sucks. Art is such an important part of culture and life. Everything that you see begins with somebody sitting down and sketching something. So art's incredibly important, and I'd like to see artists not be starving. I want to see them profit well, and the audience should also want their artists to be making money, because frankly, the audience out there, they're getting shortchanged to a large degree, because a lot of these artists are struggling. See a lot of GoFundMes for artists who get sick. Laura Martin, unfortunately, is one of them. She got sick a couple of years ago and had a GoFundMe page. And I think even Comic Book Legal Defense Fund has, done some work for some people who have been sick. There's the Hero Initiative, which has done some good work, for artists who get cancer or have health issues. So the last thing that you want, and when that stuff happens, the work suffers. They're either unable to do work, or the work that they do isn't as good as it would be if they, healthy financially. You know what I mean? So it's a marquee issue, frankly, and that's why when I run my creative teams and I produce books, I not only like to pay my artists a page rate, but I also like to give them a percentage of the sales based on their participation. You think about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where would it be without Brian Hitch? You look at that modern Cap costume, it is lifted from the pages of the Ultimates, Volume 1 through 3. But I mean, you look at Black Widow's costume, you look at Hawkeye's costume, you look at so many of what kind of was a springboard for what we have now with the MCU. And we wouldn't be anywhere without that first Ultimates run. We would not have any of this stuff. And a lot of that is the credit that needs to go to Brian Hitch, who introduced a more practical look and application to how these guys outfit themselves. And, the spandex, it works on the page. It doesn't work on screen, on the silver screen. And, it's that suspension of disbelief.
Brett, really appreciate you coming here talking about how art standards have changed over the years and some of the contributing factors to deterioration. Like I mentioned earlier, you've always got so many projects in the oven at one time or another. It's hard even, for me, I do a lot of industry news and stuff. It's hard to keep up with it. Is there anything you want to tell the audience about that maybe you've got coming down the pipe that you think is going to be something they should keep an eye out for?
Yeah, my current project that we're in production on is Agent Poso. It's a project I did with Jack Posobiec. Chuck Dixon is the writer. Sergio Cariello is one of my artists. So Agent Poso is in production. The script is finalized. We've begun on art. We're about 10 pages in. I'm going to be teasing some art next week to all of our backers who helped us out get across the finish line. That's going to be a fun book. That's one project. There's another project that is going to be published in the spring called Blood, a graphic novel. It's another book I did with Chuck Dixon. He wrote it. It was a project of some Hollywood guys who wanted to do a graphic novel and then adapt it into a live action film, which is going to be starting production, I believe, this summer. So after the graphic novel comes out, it's a 98-page graphic novel. It'll be published by Permuted Press, and that's going to be coming out in the spring. I'll start teasing and helping to promote that probably about maybe a couple months prior to it dropping. But Derlis Santa Cruz, he's the artist on the project. He's down in Brazil, hugely talented. So those are two things, and then I've got another thing which is going to be a crowdfunded project. It's called Black Tide Rising. They're preparing the campaign right now. We've done 5 pages. I'm about to assign Dave Dorman to do the cover. Black Tide Rising is an adaptation of a national best-selling book series, and it is a zombie apocalypse. However, it's told from the standpoint of a family who are military. The father is an ex-Navy SEAL. So when the apocalypse happens and everything starts to kind of break down, they're actually prepared. Unlike Walking Dead and a lot of the zombie apocalypse books that you see or shows where everybody's unprepared. So it's a family, dad who's ex-Navy SEAL, mom's ex-military, 2 daughters. So you got 2 female protagonists. That's a national bestseller by a guy named John Ringo. And on that one, I've got Chuck Dixon doing the adaptation, and I've got Derlis Santa Cruz. It's kind of the same creative team that I had on Blood, a graphic novel that's now on Black Tide Rising. So that one's going to drop. They're actually putting together the promo video now. And the pre-production art that we did, will be teased, and that's going into the video. And I'm really excited about that one because it's just beautiful work. Yeah, there's another one that I'll be announcing soon, and I think this is going to happen. And it's actually going to be a historical project that I'm doing with Larry Schweikert, who wrote Patriots: History of the United States, which is a national bestseller, New York Times #1 bestseller, and it's going to be on the Founding Fathers. So that's going to be fun.
Brett, I want to say thank you very much. got a lot of interesting, exciting projects in the pipeline, and I'm glad you could join me today.
Anytime.
Very good talking to you.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. I would appreciate it very much. It helps us attract more views for the channel. Subscribe for future commentary, comic book news, and reviews. And don't forget to ring the bell for notifications. If you want to talk comics, movies, and much, much more, you can follow me on Twitter at Wes_from_TC. With that, Salamat Po, and I'm out.